Have you ever wondered what the words left and right mean in a political context? We hear these words all the time. A policy is called left wing, or a person is identified as being on the alt right. But what do these words mean? Everyone gets that they're words for two opposing sides, but what are sides exactly? What determines whether a person is on the left or the right? For that matter, why are they called left and right anyway? And most importantly, why does it matter? Well, tonight you're going to get the answers to those questions. And it's going to be a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if, after viewing this lecture, you're going to see everything differently. Let's get started. Terminology of left and right, or left versus right, originated with the French Revolution of 1789. There was this big important meeting called the French National Assembly, where all the representatives of the different power groups got together in a room with the monarchists, that is, the people who supported the king, on the right side of the room, and the people who didn't support the monarchy seated across from them on the left side of the room. Yes, it actually comes from how people were arranged in a room. I'm as surprised as you are. This is why we say left wing and right wing, because wing is a word for a side or end of a building. Why didn't the pro-monarchists call themselves the monarchists and the anti-monarchists call themselves the anti-monarchists? Well, if you've watched the TV show Andor, which is about how the rebellion against the Galactic Empire got started in Star Wars, you would know that there can be a variety of views and political positions among those who oppose a despotic regime as well as those who support a despotic regime. Some of the people on the left were separatists. Some of the people on the left were communists. Some of the people on the right wanted an absolute monarchy, and some of them wanted a constitutional monarchy. Some of them were pro-Jedi, and some of them were human supremacists. Wait. I may be getting the show mixed up with the actual history. Well, never mind about that. The important part is that the French continued to use the terminology of left and right to refer to these different political alignments. And during the 19th century, the terminology was adopted by the rest of Europe and its colonies. So even though in any given political environment, there are often more than just two political parties. For example, in Canada, we have the Liberals and the Conservatives and the NDP. Even though there's often more than two political parties, the relationships between them came to be represented by their positions along a kind of spectrum from left to right. This spectrum came to be called the political spectrum, and here is an example of it on the slide. You can find many different versions of the political spectrum online, but this one is pretty typical. As you can see, it's organized from left to right, although it might be more helpful to think of it as like starting in the center and then sort of spreading out in both directions. In the center, we find liberalism and something else that's called social liberalism. Many political talking heads identify, may identify the terms liberal and leftist and treat them as they're interchangeable. But as you can see in this version, liberalism is smack dab in the center. And I like that because of what I said in the lecture on liberalism, that it isn't so much a political position among other political positions, but something more like the framework um, in which all of politics takes place now. So as we move left, we see what I imagine are some fairly familiar terms. The center left, social democracy and progressivism. Why is it called the center left? Well, it's the left that's closest to the center. You move further left, you get socialism and democratic socialism, which is something different from social democracy, apparently. How confusing. There are also pictures, images, which is basically the iconography associated with certain political parties and movements. There's the famous hammer and sickle over here on the far left, where it says communism, anarcho-communism, and then the word revolutionary, which is not a political position. It's an adjective. Sorry about that. Let's look at the right. We have Christian democracy, which is not a thing that we've talked about, but you may know about, you may have heard about. Liberal conservatism. What the hell is that? Isn't that an oxymoron? Well, liberal conservatism, I don't know of anybody who calls themselves a liberal conservative. Maybe people might call themselves a moderate conservative, which means that they're slightly conservative, a a sort of median between a conservative and a person who isn't insane. So we have conservatism, libertarianism. Hey, we talked about that. And on the far right, we have nationalism, fascism, and anarcho-capitalism. So in political discourse, the term liberal or progressive, the terms liberal and progressive are typically used to refer to people on the left, and the term conservative is commonly used to refer to people on the right, even though the spectrum does assign, different names to people at different points on the spectrum. But these terms are somewhat fluid. Not everyone uses them consistently. I just wanted you to know that in the lecture, I may, from time to time, use the word conservative to refer to people on the right, or progressive to refer to people on the left. This language makes it seem like the difference is between people who want to keep things the same and people who want to change them. And it is true that if we go back to the origins of the terms left and right, some of the people on the right did want to keep things the same. Well, they couldn't keep them the same because there was a revolution going on, but they wanted to go back to the way things were with the monarchy, so sort of keep them the same. Whereas the people who wanted to get rid of the monarchy certainly did want to make a change. Getting rid of the monarchy is a pretty big change. They wanted a whole different political system. However, you can also see that the people on the left did want to spread out power insofar as they wanted to get rid of the monarchy. I mean, a monarchy, at least in its absolute form, where the king has all of the power. And I find this way of thinking more helpful because it captures a sort of trend that extends both into the past before the French Revolution and into the future, our past, maybe our future after the French Revolution. There had been attempts to limit, restrict, or reduce the power of kings prior to the French Revolution, the best known of which was the English Magna Carta, which dates back to, I think, the 13th century. The Magna Carta put into writing that the king couldn't just do whatever he wanted, that there were limits to his power, and the lords and barons, the sort of people who had their little kingdom-like things under the dominion of the king, had rights and powers that the king couldn't infringe upon. The Magna Carta is just one example. It happened many different times in many different nations, but the Magna Carta has become a sort of symbol of constitutional monarchies, limiting the power of kings, and a change from the concentration of all of the power in the person of the king or monarch to it being spread out among an aristocracy of the upper classes, the people who owned land and oppressed the serfs and peasants under them who had no rights. But now the power wasn't just in one person, it was spread out among a whole class. From there, it was spread out more and more with quite a lot of work and no small amount of spilt blood to larger and larger groups of people, wider and wider, until we have the modern form of democracy where theoretically every adult has a share in the power of the state, has a say in the form of a vote. Notice that this goes along with the story that I told you in the previous lecture about liberalism and the social contract, but it's more complicated. That version of the story kind of implied that there were two states, two sets of conditions, feudalism, which was then overthrown with liberalism, and also kind of implies that the change happened all at once in a single step, represented symbolically with the notion of the social contract, which, as we discussed last time, didn't actually happen. People didn't come together in the form of a voluntary agreement. Instead, kingdoms were formed through conquest and oppression, and only very gradually was power painfully drawn away from the concentration in the monarchy, like pulling teeth. Yeah, that works. Kings have a lot of teeth, right? And today's monarchies, like the one in the UK or the one in the Netherlands, are pretty toothless. I promise I didn't plan that joke at all. The weird thing is that while practically everyone agrees where the various political orientations go on the spectrum, there isn't a consensus on what exactly the spectrum measures. So, social democracy is more left than liberalism, but more right than socialism. What does that mean? Some people think it doesn't mean anything, that what we have is just two different camps of people, like sports teams. Some people are team red and some people are team blue, and the different views they have on issues like economics, immigration, or LGBTQ rights are just the views that they happen to hold. There's no logic to them. But this can't be right. I mean, it can't be correct because there aren't two different camps. There are a whole lot of camps. Look at them. Conservatism, libertarianism, socialism, social democracy, fascism, etc., each with their own set of political views. And yet they all fit neatly on a line, apparently. So, what makes conservatives more likely to ally with fascists than with social democrats? By what metric is fascism the polar opposite of communism? Well, one answer you hear pretty often is that left and right are about collectivism versus individualism. The right is all about personal responsibility and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, whereas the left wants to raise taxes in order to redistribute wealth to the poor. On the other hand, the left has always been on the side of individual rights, whether it's abolishing slavery, the civil rights movement, or LGBTQ rights today. And people on the right opposed all of those things. They want gay and trans people to stay in the closet. So, how can the right be about individualism when the oppose individuals having the right to be different and want everyone to conform to a particular idea of normal. It's almost always people on the left who stand up to defend individual liberties. The exception being libertarians who favor individual liberties while also being on the right. So as you can see, it doesn't work. This idea of individualism, this idea of the opposition between individualism versus collectivism fails to capture what the political spectrum is about. Some people want to get rid of the political spectrum altogether and replace it with something called the political compass. Here it is on the screen. As you can see, this has two axes instead of one. In addition to left and right, it adds a second up-down axis with authoritarian at the top and libertarian at the bottom. It was created by libertarians who got tired of being associated with nationalists and fascists. And who could blame them, really? The political compass has its own problems, however, but they will become clear later on, so we don't have to get into it right now. If we want to understand what the left-right political spectrum is really about and why it's important, all we have to do is go back to its roots in the French Revolution. Here the split was between those who wanted to keep the old regime of the kings and nobles having all the power and those who wanted to replace the system with one that was more equal and democratic. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what it's always been about. What unites the diverse groups and perspectives on the left side of the political spectrum is that what unites the diverse groups and perspectives on the left side of the political spectrum is that they want to make society more equal, whether in terms of political power, wealth, or privilege. And what unites the different groups on the right side of the political spectrum is that they want to maintain the existing hierarchies or make society even more unequal. The left wants to spread out power, and the right wants to concentrate power. And the more you want to spread out power, the further left you are. Social democrats want to empower workers and redistribute wealth by taxing the wealthy. But they're okay with income inequality because that's an inevitable result of capitalism. Communists, on the other hand, want to get rid of capitalism altogether and put an end to income inequality. Communism is more left-wing than social democracy because the society they want is more equal. On the other hand, get it? Right hand, left hand. On the other hand, conservatives want to maintain the existing social hierarchies of class and race and gender, and also increase wealth inequality by lowering taxes and on the wealthy and corporations, while fascists want an authoritarian society without individual liberties. They're usually white supremacists, and sometimes they want to get rid of democracy altogether. So fascism is more right-wing than conservatism because fascists want even more inequality. Get it? So when I was trying to sort of try out this lecture on a friend, sort of bounce ideas off of him, let him know where I was going with it, he said, wait, I can think of people on the left who don't want to spread out power, and I can think of people on the right who don't want to concentrate power. What about Marxist-Leninists? People who stand the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a dictatorship. It was all about concentrating power. And yet, communism is aligned with the left, right? And what about anarcho-capitalists? Like anarchism is a left-wing position, but capitalism is normally associated with the right. How does that fit in? This was very helpful because I had to come up with a response, like responding to objections in an essay. And the response that I came up with was the person that you argue with online who says he's a leftist but supports Putin is not a counterexample to the logic that the right is about concentrating power and the left is about spreading out power, because politics is not like gender. You don't get to just identify as a leftist and everybody has to believe you.
Oh my goodness, wait till you see Lady Pool. She is gorgeous. She just had a baby too, and can't even tell.
I don't think you're supposed to say that.
That's okay. I identify as a feminist.
You see, there's this thing that people who wanted to do politics invented a really long time ago. It's called lying. This gets back to what I was saying at the beginning of the course about arguments. That things that we make arguments about are not matters of opinion. If they were really matters of opinion, there'd be no argument to make. It's not like, do you prefer Star Trek or Star Wars? Or do you think Marvel movies are better than DC movies? Politics is very different from what movies you like. Politics is about real life. It has real consequences. So I'm going to break with custom here and tell you something about my personal life. My girlfriend has type 1 diabetes, which is an incurable but totally manageable illness. But because for most of her adult life she has been unable to access the medical care that she needs, it has been slowly destroying her body. She used to be a hardworking member of society, like really, really hardworking, unusually hardworking. But now, not only can't she hold down a job, I have to spend a not insignificant chunk of my time taking care of her. Why has my girlfriend been unable to access needed health care? Because previous conservative governments have cut health care spending. So there are fewer doctors, nurses, technicians, equipment needed to do tests, etc., and some more complicated stuff. So if you're wondering why this lecture has been delayed for so long, it's because people don't think politics is important. Politics is not like sports teams or the what kind of movies you like, because politics has real consequences. And I wanted to give an example of how it has consequences for you specifically. And here's something that might blow your mind. Being apolitical is not really an option. Why? Because when fewer voters turn up to vote, right-wing political parties, so the conservatives here or the Republicans in the US, do better. They're more likely to win elections when the lower voter turnout is lower. How does that happen? Well, it's complicated, but the very simple version is that demographically, the group of people that tends to vote conservative, right wing, also tends to more consistently show up to vote on voting day. And that group is old people. Why are old people more likely to turn up to vote? I don't know. Um, One theory is that many of them are retired and consequently they just have more time. My point is, you can't actually be apolitical, meaning you can't not choose a side because not choosing a side, because refusing to choose a side has the effect of favoring one side over the other. I'm sorry, but I don't make the rules. I don't want to have to vote either. I'd rather be talking about phenomenology or how Andor is the best Star Wars series. But right now, talking about politics is my job. And Star Wars isn't real, and we don't get to do the kind of heroism that we see on Star Wars. But the closest we can get to heroism in real life is me here telling you things you don't want to hear, and also voting. Geez, who thought a course called Reasoning About Social Issues was going to get political? If we consider the list of positions that are associated with the left, meaning things that people who identify with the left or who are identified by other people as being on the left, they seem to be pretty consistently in line with spreading out power and trying to make people equal through things like having higher taxes on the wealthy, regulating businesses so that they don't exploit employees and consumers, that sort of thing. The right, on the other hand, hand, see what I did there? It's not immediately clear that the views that are typically held by people aligned with the political right are about concentrating power or maintaining hierarchies. Some of them, sure. It's easy to see pro-military and pro-cop as being about enforcing power hierarchies. But what about small government? That sounds like the opposite of concentrating power. Being against regulating businesses, but for regulating women's bodies seems kind of weirdly inconsistent. But neither of these positions is clearly about concentrating power or maintaining hierarchies. In fact, this list of the most popular positions on social issues among conservatives or people on the right doesn't seem to be consistently about anything. Like, how can you be in favor of small government, but also want more cops and a big military? Like, what says big government more than people with guns enforcing the government's decisions and policies? Small government, lower taxes on the wealthy, and letting corporations do whatever they want seems to hang together in some sort of consistent philosophy. But why would the same people oppose reproductive freedom and letting people use their preferred pronouns? Like, are you for freedom or aren't you? So, what the hell is going on? Why does conservatism seem to be a grab bag of unrelated or even contradictory ideas? The explanation is really interesting and also really important, but it's going to take a while to get there because it's also very complicated. There are a number of reasons, but the simple version is that it's because of, you guessed it, capitalism. Capitalism is responsible for all of the good things and all of the bad things that we're dealing with in life today. We're going to be talking about capitalism later on in this lecture. We're going to see how the story of capitalism intersects with the story of liberalism, overthrowing and replacing feudalism, which intersects with the story about the group of political alignments that coalesce into what we call the left, is about spreading out power, usually political power, but other types of power as well. We'll get to it. Spreading out power as widely and as equally as possible among all the people in a society. And what we call the right is that group of political views and interests that opposes this project. The reason why we still use these words, left and right, that originated in a seating arrangement in France in the 1880s is because there is actually a strong and kind of hard to miss, honestly, continuity running all the way from the people who said, hey, maybe having one guy have all of the power of the state and the rest of us having none is maybe not a very good system. To people today saying maybe we shouldn't discriminate against people just because they aren't comfortable with the gender they were assigned at birth. In 1789, the people on the left wanted to replace monarchy with democracy, and the people on the right didn't want to replace monarchy with democracy. They wanted to keep monarchy. In the 1850s, the people on the left wanted to get rid of slavery, and the people on the right wanted to keep slavery. In the 1910s and 20s, people on the left wanted to extend the vote to women, and people on the right didn't want to extend the right to vote to women. In the 1990s and 2000s, the people on the left wanted to extend the right to marry to same-sex couples, and you guessed it, people on the right didn't want to extend the right to marry to same-sex couples. Do you see a pattern here? Right now, the fight seems to be over whether trans people should be allowed to exist. What do you think everyone will believe 100 years from now?
Partisanship turns politics into like a team sport in a way that I think is really problematic. Like you can always demand better of your preferred political party and in fact should. Like, just because you identify, say, as a liberal doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything Mark Carney does. And in fact, as a liberal, like you should like as a liberal supporting Mark Carney, in that case, you should demand better of him if you feel as though he's not keeping his words that he ran on electorally, if he's not staying true to what you understand the party principles of your preferred ideology to be. And also, frankly, like you're allowed to have expectations that differ from your neighbor's expectations from our political leaders and organize and advocate for those expectations. So, like, your neighbor might not care about what the minimum wage is, for example, and you might think that we should have like universal basic income. And obviously that's unlikely from the liberals, but I'm just saying that like, you can vote for a particular party and not necessarily like you shouldn't agree with everything any one political party says because like that's just not really how humans work. We're more nuanced than that. And yeah, I find it difficult because I think a lot of people, a response I get a lot when I critique Mark Carney is a lot of people say, oh, I guess you're conservative. I guess you want to Pierre Poilievre. I'm not shaming anyone for their votes when they are asking me to like, I'm not shaming anyone for their votes when I critique Mark Carney, just as I wouldn't be doing so in any other instance except for Trump. I will shame you for voting for Trump. But like when someone is elected and holds the power, you don't just stop because your team wins, like, or just because your team loses, you have to oppose everything, like that's not how any of this should work. And we have a better democracy when we hold our leaders to account and push for the society that we want, regardless of how it aligns on a political spectrum.